Do it! Do it! Kill me! I'm here! Do it now! Kill me!
Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Q-Man channel. Please consider hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like if you enjoy the content. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Predator from 1987, specifically the new remastered version. The humid, oppressive air of the Central American jungle hangs heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and unseen life. We follow a highly specialized elite team of commandos, veterans of countless covert operations. Dutch Schaefer, the team leader, possesses the quiet, steely competence that only comes from years spent navigating the razor's edge of global conflicts, perhaps drawing on the kind of pragmatic leadership honed in his earlier military career. With him are seasoned operators like Dylan, whose sharp business sense now complements his tactical prowess. Mac, the ever-reliable heavy weapons man, and Blaine, whose iconic, almost playful confidence masks deep experience. They have been inserted deep behind enemy lines to extract a hostage. The initial mission proceeds with brutal efficiency. They locate the dilapidated compound, dispatching the seasoned but ultimately outmatched guerrillas with practiced professional violence. Yet, as they secure the area and prepare for extraction, a subtle wrongness begins to permeate the jungle. The silence is too profound, broken only by the distant, unfamiliar screech of some unseen creature. Their first real indication that something is amiss comes with the discovery of a captured comrade, gruesomely skinned and hung high in the canopy, the sheer alien nature of the wounds baffling these hardened professionals. This is not the work of any known adversary. It defies conventional combat logic. Fear, an emotion these men have long suppressed, begins to stir. The turning point arrives with the death of Billy, the team's tracker. An invisible force strikes him down with impossible speed and power, leaving behind only a faint impression in the mud and the lingering, unsettling sound of displaced foliage. Dutch and his men, masters of setting traps and anticipating human enemies, are now the prey. They quickly realize they are being stalked by something that sees them, studies them, and is vastly superior in terms of stealth and predatory skill. As the jungle closes in, the team attempts to regroup and fight back, using their considerable firepower. They discover evidence of their pursuer, a shimmering distortion in the air, bizarre scorch marks, and a trail of technological debris that seems impossibly advanced for this remote setting. The realization dawns. They are not fighting men. They are fighting a hunter, a creature whose very existence defies their understanding of warfare. This silent, patient stalker, later revealed to be a predator, drawn by the very violence the commandos specialize in, treats their sophisticated weaponry as little more than nuisances. The losses mount quickly. Mac is brutally taken, followed by the desperate, loud demise of Dillon and Hawkins. The disciplined military structure dissolves under the onslaught of the unseen enemy. Only Dutch, the resourceful leader, and the surviving, now almost feral medic, remain. Faced with an enemy that defeats technology and overwhelming firepower, Dutch makes the only choice left to a survivor: abandon the tools of modern war and revert to primal instinct. He strips down, covering himself in the mud, blending with the environment the predator so effortlessly dominates. This shift acknowledges the predator's own adherence to a code of hunting, however alien. The final confrontation is a desperate, close-quarters duel between two ultimate apex predators, albeit from vastly different worlds. Dutch uses traps, improvisation, and sheer grit, reminiscent of the raw survivalism that underpins the narratives of classic action heroes who find strength not in their gear, but in their core resilience. He manages to wound the alien hunter, forcing it to discard its cloaking device and reveal its formidable, grotesque form. In a final, explosive clash, Dutch defeats the predator, using a massive, jury-rigged log trap. As the defeated alien recognizes its failure, it activates a self-destruct mechanism, its own strange sense of honor dictating a spectacular end rather than capture. Dutch barely escapes the blast, rescued by a passing military helicopter, leaving the smoking jungle behind as the silent testament to a battle fought against a force beyond military comprehension. He walks away not as a triumphant soldier, but as a survivor who has encountered something truly other. The oppressive green canopy of the jungle seemed to swallow sound, amplifying every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig into a potential harbinger of doom. Dutch Schaefer, ever the picture of contained intensity, led his team with the economy of movement born from years commanding behind enemy lines. A man whose career trajectory saw him move from straight military deployment to the specialized, deniable operations that defined the era. His lieutenant, Dillon, carried an air of ambitious tension, the transition from a purely military life to the cutthroat world of private contracting perhaps not entirely smooth, evident in his watchful, slightly too calculating eyes. When they found the remnants of their predecessors, the stripped corpses hanging like gruesome meat hooks, the professional veneer cracked. This wasn't guerrilla warfare. This was butchery executed with surgical, almost ritualistic precision. Mac, whose usual demeanor was one of solid, unflappable readiness behind his heavy weaponry, started scanning the treetops with a frantic intensity that betrayed his growing unease. Even Blaine, who habitually mocked the danger with a kind of bravado honed perhaps during his time in specialized airborne units, fell silent, the cigarette dangling forgotten between his lips. The invisible attack on Billy was devastating precisely because it violated every known rule of engagement these soldiers lived by. Billy, the quiet observer attuned to the slightest shift in the terrain, was simply erased. When they found the blood trail leading nowhere, the psychological pressure became palpable. They were fighting ghosts with thermal vision, something that understood camouflage better than any human operator. The predator wasn't interested in objectives or territory. It was interested in the hunt, viewing these highly trained men as challenging, dangerous game. Their attempts to establish a perimeter became pathetic efforts against an opponent that could dismantle their defenses without ever being seen. When they finally caught glimpses of the shimmering distortion, it was less a visual confirmation and more a horrifying realization that their advanced optics, their night vision, their very reliance on technology, was being used against them. This creature was a living evolution of the perfect hunter. The air grew thick not just with humidity, but with the stench of fear and ozone left by the aliens' advanced technology. The cascade of deaths was swift and brutal, each loss chipping away at Dutch's carefully constructed leadership facade. Dylan's last stand, a desperate flurry of automatic gunfire directed at an unseen blur, was a tragic testament to his unyielding commitment to fighting until the last possible second. When only Dutch and Poncho, the medic whose focus had narrowed solely on immediate survival, remained, the rules of engagement dissolved completely. Dutch's decision to shed his armor, to smear himself with river mud, a desperate mirroring of the creature's own natural camouflage, was a profound act of surrender to the environment and an acknowledgement of his opponent's superiority in that domain. He wasn't fighting as a soldier anymore. He was fighting as a cornered animal, relying on the basic, brutal intelligence that predated all their training manuals. The final confrontation was less a battle and more a desperate dance with death. When the alien's cloak flickered and failed, revealing the terrible, armored visage beneath, a being clearly evolved for exactly this purpose, it was a sight that promised madness. Dutch, wielding a crude log trap, leveraged his knowledge of physics and gravity against pure alien biology. The victory was not clean. It was a raw, exhausting struggle that left him shaking, staring at the smoking remains of the self-destructing alien trophy. Walking out of that jungle, hearing the whirring blades of the rescue chopper, Dutch wasn't thinking about medals or debriefings. He was processing the sheer, terrifying reality that there existed a hierarchy of predators, and he had, by the sheer force of human will, managed to scrape his way to the temporary top of the food chain. The jungle seemed to breathe around Dutch, a suffocating emerald lung that magnified every bead of sweat trickling down his temple. He carried the burden of command not with arrogance, but with a deep, almost melancholic understanding of the price of success in their line of work, a price paid in blood and forgotten morality. His men, the best government assets money could hire, were frayed silk stretched taut over steel muscle. Mac, usually so steady when cradling his massive machine gun, now kept nervously slapping his chest where his ammo belt rested, as if checking the physical reassurance of hardware against the psychological assault of the unseen. The initial shock of the skinned bodies had been replaced by a cold, analytical terror. They were being hunted by a supreme intellect that treated their military maneuvers as quaint, predictable displays. This creature, this predator, wasn't just stronger. It was patient, possessing the leisure of an apex predator who knows its prey cannot escape the confines of the hunting ground. It was the ultimate critic of their trade, finding their carefully rehearsed tactics clumsy and loud. When the invisible force snatched Hawkins, the sound was not a scream, but a sickening, wet tearing, followed by a sudden, unnatural silence that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. Dylan, whose strategic mind usually calculated escape routes while simultaneously planning an offensive, finally broke his disciplined restraint, unleashing a torrent of automatic fire into the dense foliage. It was a cry of frustration, a final desperate assertion of dominance that the jungle immediately mocked by swallowing the noise whole. The loss of Dylan hit Dutch hard. He recognized in Dylan's final futile rage the last vestiges of the purely kinetic, conventional soldier, the man who believed overwhelming force always solved the equation. Dutch, however, having spent years in shadow wars, understood that sometimes the equation demanded surrender to the environment. His own transition, stripping down to bare skin and coating himself in the earth sludge, was an almost spiritual act of shedding his identity as a highly equipped soldier. He was reverting to the basic, territorial instinct of a threatened animal, a move that paradoxically made him finally visible and yet invisible to the alien's thermal senses. The final moments before the confrontation were taut, with a silence broken only by the frantic pounding of his own heart. When the predator finally stood revealed, its articulated armor gleaming dully, its mandibles flexing. Dutch saw not a monster, but an opponent adhering to its own immutable ancient laws of engagement. A hunter seeking a worthy kill, not a mere executioner. The ensuing fight was ugly, stripped bare of tactical grace. It was the collision of high-tech alien engineering against hard-earned, mud-caked human ingenuity. When the massive log swung down, propelled by Dutch's desperate calculation of mass and gravity, the resulting impact was the sound of an ecosystem reasserting its brutal, primary order. Even as the alien's internal countdown began, a chilling self-termination protocol signifying ultimate defeat in its own code, Dutch didn't pause to savor victory. He ran, driven by the raw, biological imperative to escape the impending annihilation. Emerging from the smoke and debris, blinking against the sudden intrusion of the daylight heralded by the approaching helicopter, he carried the look of a man who had gazed into the eye of true wilderness, finding it infinitely more complex and terrifying than any geopolitical conflict he had ever known. He had survived not by being better armed, but by being more desperate, more primal. The extraction was jarringly clinical after the raw, visceral chaos of the jungle floor. The military helicopter's rotors beat a rhythmic, indifferent pulse against the humid air, a stark contrast to the silent, intense dread that had permeated the trees just moments before. Dutch, physically whole but profoundly altered, was hauled aboard, his mud-caked body a testament to a battle fought entirely outside the parameters of conventional warfare. Inside the sterile confines of the aircraft, the other survivors, the remnants of the command team, now silent figures clinging to survival, seemed distant, their shared experience too isolating to easily articulate. The initial debriefing, when it came, was a study in bureaucratic disbelief battling undeniable evidence. Military intelligence officers, accustomed to tracing missile trajectories and monitoring known threats, struggled to process Dutch's fragmented accounts of plasma casters, cloaking fields, and a 7-foot-tall, biomechanical hunter. The sheer audacity of the creature's existence rendered their carefully catalogued threat assessments obsolete. Dutch watched them, recognizing the familiar flicker of dismissal in their eyes, the tendency of the organized machine to reject data that doesn't fit neatly into established protocols. He knew the official report would likely sanitize the horror, perhaps attributing the team's annihilation to a highly sophisticated but terrestrial guerrilla group utilizing experimental weaponry. For Dutch, the jungle had not merely been a battlefield. It had been a crucible that burned away the layers of his career, the uniforms, the strategy briefings, the chain of command. He was left with the core of himself, the pure survival mechanism that allowed him to outwit an extraterrestrial hunter. This experience recalibrated his entire understanding of capability. When he looked at his hands now, he didn't see the hands of a decorated Special Forces officer. He saw the hands that had fashioned a spear from a broken branch and used mud as a shield. The quiet competence that defined his early career was now overlaid with a profound, almost haunted knowledge of what truly lurked beyond the known map. As the helicopter flew them toward civilization, leaving the steaming green hell behind, Dutch glanced back. He knew the threat wasn't truly gone. The predator had retreated certainly, but the encounter had confirmed a chilling possibility. They were not alone, and the rules of engagement had just been rewritten by an entity whose only motive was the thrill of the ultimate hunt. The sense of safety, an illusion meticulously maintained throughout his professional life, had vanished permanently, replaced by the unsettling awareness that somewhere out there, another silent observer was probably already calculating the parameters of the next encounter, awaiting the next deployment of elite, challenging prey. The helicopter's ascent provided a cruel panoramic view of the dense canopy, the very expanse that had just been their tomb and their proving ground. Dutch felt the familiar, if unwanted, pull of residual adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that no amount of rest could mend. He watched the retreating jungle, understanding that the real psychological extraction was far from complete. The officers in the briefing room, crisp in their starched uniforms, were performing the necessary ritual of compartmentalization, trying to force the impossible into the known geometry of geopolitical threat analysis. They saw tactical failure. Dutch saw an ontological shock. He remembered the casual confidence Blaine had worn, the kind of man who believed his custom weaponry and finely tuned instincts made him untouchable. That confidence, so rooted in human superiority, had been extinguished instantly by a foe whose technology suggested they had underestimated the universe itself. Dillon's final, furious assault, aimed at the shimmering air where his comrade had just been, represented the failure of military doctrine when faced with something utterly outside its textbooks, a hunter with perfect situational awareness. Dutch's survival wasn't a victory of strategy, but a victory of desperation, a raw, ugly regression to the most fundamental forms of conflict. The mud, which had initially seemed a repulsive necessity, now felt like a strange, protective shroud. It was the only thing that had truly leveled the playing field, forcing the alien hunter to engage on terms that weren't purely technological. This shift, from relying on the tools of his trade, developed over decades of specialized military engagement, to relying on nothing but instinct and environment, was the true scar he carried. His entire career had been built on mastering the known variables. This creature introduced an infinite, terrifying unknown. As the landscape flattened into the recognizable terrain of military staging areas, the illusion of control returned to the faces around him, but not to Dutch. He knew that the Predator, in its own silent, alien way, had also conducted a successful assessment. It had tested their weaknesses, cataloged their strengths, and ultimately found the experience worthwhile enough to warrant self-destruction rather than capture. This implied a code, a discipline, that ironically mirrored the best of what Dutch himself represented as a leader: adherence to the integrity of the hunt. He looked out the small window as the sun began to break through the lower clouds, illuminating the world in harsh, ordinary light. The world was safe, officially. The threat was neutralized, officially. But Dutch carried the certainty that he had been graded, marked, and perhaps filed away as challenging game for a future excursion. The silence in his mind was no longer the quiet concentration of a soldier planning a raid. It was the watchful, waiting silence of something that knows it has just survived a close call, with the true, untamed wildness lurking just beyond the edge of human perception. His career, built on conquering territory, had just taught him the terrifying lesson that some territories are simply not meant to be conquered. The return to the familiar structured chaos of the base felt profoundly dissonant. The air conditioning in the temporary processing tent seemed to actively repel the memory of the jungle's suffocating heat, yet the heat, the sweat, the alien smell of the jungle clung to Dutch like a second skin that no amount of antiseptic scrubbing could remove. He watched the medics move around the surviving members of his team, applying sterile bandages to surface wounds while failing entirely to address the deep lacerations in their psyches. Poncho, the medic, was staring blankly at a clipboard, his eyes wide with the vacant focus of a man who had seen the limits of human anatomy, overwhelmed by something fundamentally non-human. Dutch knew his status within the hierarchy had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer merely a commander. He was a witness to the impossible, a survivor whose testimony was inherently suspect. His history, the decorated service record, the flawless execution of sensitive operations, was now his greatest liability in convincing the skeptical brass. They wanted plausible deniability. He could only offer alien truth. He remembered a story from his early days in the service, a briefing on unconventional warfare where the instructor had warned them against the fog of war. This was no fog. This was absolute cold clarity provided by a non-terrestrial entity. The quiet moments were the worst. At night, the silence of the barracks was pierced not by the familiar sounds of military life, but by the memory of the predator's low, guttural chuffing, a sound of amusement more terrifying than any battle cry. He would wake up checking the corners of the room, instinctively seeking out the barely perceptible shimmer of a cloak that wasn't there. His finely tuned sense of situational awareness, the trait that had earned him his reputation as a meticulous planner, now tormented him with phantom threats. The irony was not lost on him. His entire professional life, dedicated to mastering the art of killing other men efficiently, had prepared him only to be sophisticated, high-quality sustenance for a superior hunter. The predator operated without politics, without hidden agendas. It was pure, focused predation. That simplicity, that adherence to a brutal, ancient code, was something Dutch, the hardened soldier who had navigated countless layers of human deceit, could almost respect, even as it had nearly ended him. He felt a strange kinship with the fallen, especially Dylan. Dylan, ever reaching for the recognizable solution, more fire, more tactical advantage, had died fighting like a conventional soldier confronting a conventional enemy. Dutch survived because he had been forced to unlearn everything, to become the thing they hunted, a resourceful animal fighting for its territory. As he prepared to leave the staging area, returning to the world where threats wore uniforms and claimed responsibility, Dutch carried the knowledge that the most dangerous frontier wasn't located on any geopolitical map, but existed in the silent, vast darkness above, where hunters with plasma cannons roam. He was free from the jungle, but he would never truly escape the hunt. The processing facility, with its harsh fluorescent lighting, felt like an interrogation chamber designed to scrub away the grime of the jungle, while simultaneously trying to extract the inconvenient truth. Dutch walked through the motions of medical checks and preliminary interviews, his answers measured, careful, designed to give the assembled intelligence officers exactly what they needed to construct a manageable narrative. A clash with highly trained, technologically advanced Soviet-backed mercenaries gone rogue. It was a fiction he could live with, one that kept the Pentagon from panicking about interstellar game preserves being established in Allied territory. His departure from the base was quiet, an unscheduled release fueled by the desire to put distance between himself and the sanitized versions of his survival. He didn't seek immediate civilian life, the structured quiet of a remote cabin, perhaps, where the noise of human civilization couldn't drown out the subtle whispers of the wild he now anticipated everywhere. He packed sparingly, eschewing the heavy body armor and array of automatic weapons that had proven so futile. Those tools belonged to the man he used to be, the man the predator had judged and found wanting. What he kept were the simple things, the salvaged, crude knife he'd fashioned during his isolation, and perhaps a single heavy pistol, not for fighting, but for defense against the mundane threats he now knew how to differentiate from the truly existential ones. He realized his career was over, not through official termination, but through obsolescence. How could he command a unit when he knew, fundamentally, that there existed an opponent against whom all military doctrine was mere theater? This new reality fostered a strange, obsessive vigilance. Driving back toward civilization, Dutch found himself constantly scanning the tree lines, not for enemy patrols, but for that almost imperceptible break in the thermal spectrum, the whisper of displaced air that signaled the passing of something vast and unseen. The world, once a map of known boundaries and established rules of engagement, had become porous, filled with potential ambush sites. He understood, with a clarity born of near death, that the universe didn't care about human ambition or military might. It only cared about capability in the moment of confrontation. He would live the rest of his life listening to the echoes of that alien world. Every shadow held a possible hunter. Every unknown sound carried the threat of a silent, superior intelligence. The irony wasn't that he had fought an alien. The true, lasting terror was realizing that for all his training, all his experience in the darkest corners of the globe, he had never truly understood what it meant to be hunted until the jungle showed him. He was permanently stationed on the perimeter of human understanding, an unwilling scout forever marked by the knowledge that the most dangerous things in existence don't announce themselves with flags or manifestos, but with silence and a thermal shimmer. The silence that enveloped Dutch now was a different creature entirely from the professional quiet he once commanded. It was a heavy, internal silence, the kind that settles after a catastrophic detonation, leaving behind ringing ears and a world seen through a cracked lens. He found the cabin he sought nestled deep in the American wilderness, a place far from the dense tropical humidity but still steeped in the primal atmosphere of untamed land. Here, surrounded by towering pines instead of suffocating vines, the ghosts of his team were less physically present but more mentally pervasive. He didn't seek therapy. Such concepts were for soldiers dealing with conventional trauma. Dutch was dealing with metaphysical shock. His focus narrowed obsessively on control. Not the control of men or missions, but the control of his immediate, tangible surroundings. He began to meticulously log weather patterns, wind direction, and animal behavior with the same rigor he once applied to satellite intelligence reports, not to predict human movement, but to gauge the natural fluctuations of an environment that could suddenly become host to the unnatural. He often sat by the window in the twilight, the time when human vision begins to fail and reliance on artificial aids, or the alien's inherent thermal superiority, becomes key. He'd test himself, closing his eyes, trying to sense the slight temperature differential of a passing deer, straining to push his own senses beyond their known limits, hoping to replicate, in some minuscule way, the predator's effortless awareness. It was an endless, self-imposed training regimen with no final exam, only the lingering cold dread of perpetual readiness. He thought often of the self-destruct mechanism. That alien warrior, facing defeat, chose annihilation over compromise or capture. It spoke volumes about a culture entirely dedicated to the purity of the hunt. This wasn't a matter of national loyalty or ideology. It was about maintaining the integrity of the kill. Dutch found himself wrestling with a perverse respect for that absolute commitment, a commitment that starkly contrasted with the murky, often compromised objectives that fueled his own career. Occasionally, a low-flying aircraft would pass overhead, the distant thrum of its engine causing a momentary, involuntary flinch. He recognized the familiar sound, yet his gut still tensed, waiting for the high-pitched whine of plasma charging. He had learned that when the rules of engagement cease to exist, paranoia becomes the highest form of prudence. Dutch Schaefer, the elite operative, had been demoted by the universe. He was now just a solitary man, permanently stationed on high alert, forever listening to the silence, waiting for the jungle to breathe again. The isolation of the cabin was both a sanctuary and a subtle form of continued confinement. Dutch had traded the concrete walls of the military compound for the wooden walls of solitude, but the perimeter remained the same, a boundary against an unseen, overwhelming force. He found himself reverting to habits ingrained during his most grueling survival training exercises, the ones designed to break men down and rebuild them using only the bare minimum for subsistence. He was refining himself into a harder, leaner instrument, stripping away the reliance on infrastructure that had been so easily neutralized in the jungle. He started building things, not complex traps like the one that saved him, but simple, necessary structures, better ways to secure firewood, ingenious methods for purifying stream water. Each completed task was a small, tangible victory against the chaos he had witnessed, a way to impose human order onto a corner of the world that felt inherently unpredictable. This meticulous focus on the material reality, the weight of an axe, the grain of the wood, was his anchor against the abstract terror of the extraterrestrial encounter. Sometimes, he would examine the few remaining photographs of his old team, running a thumb over Blaine's smiling, overconfident face. He wondered if Blaine, in those final, terrifying moments, had understood that his arrogance had been based on too small a scale of reference. They were giants in their own conflict zones, yet utterly insignificant against a hunter that operated outside the context of human history. That realization carried a deep, pervasive humility, a trait utterly antithetical to the swagger required of a high-level Special Forces commander. The most difficult thing to reconcile was the creature's almost honorable conduct within its own savage framework. It didn't attack them when they were recovering or resting. It engaged when they were functioning, when the hunt was on. This perverse symmetry, Dutch being the ultimate soldier fighting the ultimate hunter, was a philosophical knot he couldn't untangle. He had succeeded by discarding his specialization and embracing the animalistic core, effectively becoming the predator's equal on its own terms, albeit temporarily. He never reported anything further, not even to the few trusted contacts he still possessed. To speak of it was to invite ridicule or, worse, forced internment in a facility where his sanity would be systematically dismantled. Dutch understood that his knowledge was now a solitary burden, a truth too heavy for the established world to bear. He lived now in the shadow of the awareness that somewhere, perhaps on a planet light years away, another predator was cleaning its gear, reviewing the data from this unsuccessful hunt, and noting the survival of Dutch Schaefer as a statistical anomaly, a dangerous variable to be accounted for in the next deployment. He was safe, for now, but perpetually poised for the return of the intergalactic trophy hunter. The seasons turned, bringing a cold, sharp clarity to the woods that the jungle humidity had suppressed. The snows, when they came, provided a different kind of camouflage, one that was stark, white, and unforgivingly honest. Dutch found that the deep snow cover offered a perverse comfort. It muted ambient noise, making the small sounds of the forest stand out, and it revealed tracks with brutal clarity. He often walked the perimeter of his self-imposed territory, studying the patterns of the wildlife, the cautious deer, the territorial coyote, and in doing so, he inadvertently studied the predator's methodology. The hunter used the environment as its primary tool. Dutch was learning to read the environment as if it were a tactical map left by the alien itself. He began to feel a strange, almost philosophical kinship with the wilderness. The jungle had stripped him down to essence, and the temperate forest was allowing him to rebuild himself based on that refined core. He was a man constantly anticipating pressure changes, wind shifts, and the minute disturbances that signaled something moving with unnatural purpose. This hypervigilance was no longer a symptom of trauma. It had become his default operating system, permanently installed. He moved with a quiet fluidity that surprised even him, his steps calculated to leave minimal disturbance, a shadow of the professionalism he once wielded, now applied entirely to self-preservation. There were moments, usually late at night when the fire had burned down to embers, that he wrestled with the sheer scale of what he had encountered. All his training, the marksmanship, the demolitions, the psychological warfare, was specialized for human conflict, a predictable contest of wills governed by human limitations. The Predator suggested a cosmos utterly indifferent to those limitations, a universe where evolution had taken paths leading to perfection in brutality, untainted by morality or diplomacy. It was humbling in a way that no military defeat ever could have been. Dutch never imagined returning to service, nor did he fear being sought out by his former employers. He suspected that the official line, the cover story, was now so thick that he had effectively been erased as an active asset, relegated to the status of a deeply traumatized casualty. This obscurity was his greatest shield. He preferred the honest threat of a mountain lion stalking his perimeter to the veiled threat of a government official asking too many pointed questions about plasma rifle residue. He lived in quiet anticipation, not of peace, but of the next inevitable test. The encounter hadn't broken him. It had merely upgraded his understanding of danger. He was the surviving specimen from a failed extraterrestrial expedition, and if that creature, or others like it, ever returned to this sector, Dutch Schaefer would be waiting. He was no longer waiting for rescue or orders. He was waiting, armed with the only weapons that truly mattered now: primal instinct and the hard-won knowledge of how to disappear when facing a hunter from the stars. The passing of time only sharpened the edges of Dutch's isolation. The winter gave way to spring, and the emerging greenery of the forest felt less like a promise of life, and more like a return to the suffocating camouflage of the jungle, albeit painted in cooler, less threatening hues. He walked the snowmelt trails, his senses now finely tuned to the subtleties of the environment. He understood that the predator, if it were to return, would not be announced by a grand invasion. It would be a quiet, methodical selection process, the creature treating the vast, empty American wilderness as its own specialized, expansive hunting ground. Dutch had discarded any pretense of returning to his former life. The uniform, the rank, the carefully constructed persona of the elite operator, all had been shed alongside his tactical vest in that Central American swamp. What remained was something leaner, more essential. He maintained a small, hidden cache of specialized gear, not for combat against men, but as contingency against the impossible. He kept diagrams he'd sketched from memory of the alien's skeletal structure, the placement of its targeting laser, the subtle ways its cloaking field reacted to moisture, a personal field manual against an enemy that existed outside all known military intelligence. He often reflected on Dylan's last moments, the desperate, noisy defiance. That was the old way. Stand your ground. Overwhelm with force. Dutch's survival was predicated on the exact opposite. Absolute surrender to humility, becoming smaller, quieter, more rooted in the earth than the technology that had betrayed them. He found himself appreciating the quiet dignity of nature, the way a predator in the wild hunts only what it needs, observing a code of sustainability that the extraterrestrial seemed to share in its own ritualistic way. The psychological toll manifested in a relentless internal dialogue. He'd run scenarios constantly. If the creature deploys its net, how does one use the surrounding timber for leverage? If the plasma caster locks on, is the thermal signature too large to break line of sight behind solid granite? These were not idle fantasies. They were necessary mental exercises to keep his mind sharp, preventing the trauma from settling into debilitating inertia. He was perpetually preparing for a deployment that would never be officially sanctioned, a mission with the highest possible stakes against an enemy whose existence the world was willfully denying. He knew, with bone-deep certainty, that his survival was a fluke, an anomaly born from luck intersecting with his ultimate desperation. He had cheated the system once. But systems, whether human or alien, tend toward equilibrium. Dutch understood that he had merely bought time. The next time the jungle breathed, or the next time the stars aligned just so, the universe might demand its debt be paid. And when that day came, he would meet it not as a soldier, but as the cornered animal that had briefly managed to wound the king of the jungle. The turning point, Dutch realized, wasn't the log trap. It was the moment he accepted that he was no longer fighting for a flag, a government, or even for the abstract concept of victory. He was fighting for the brief, shining moment of continued biological existence, a fight that transcended ideology. This realization brought a cold clarity, stripping away the last vestiges of his military conditioning that demanded he seek recognition or justification. The jungle had taught him that true competence is silent and unrecorded. His days were now structured around the principle of low visibility. He stopped using the roads entirely, relying on long, circuitous routes through dense undergrowth and rugged terrain, moving like a phantom across the landscape. He learned to track not just the wildlife, but the patterns of human encroachment, the faint smell of gasoline, the distant, mechanical whine of logging equipment, and treated these signs of civilization with the same wariness he reserved for unexplained thermal spikes. Civilization, he now understood, was loud, predictable, and ultimately, a liability. He carried a deep, private grief for his men, a weight that settled heavier than any equipment he'd ever carried. Dylan's ambition, Mac's steadfast loyalty, even Billy's quiet observations, all extinguished by a perfectly executed hunt. He never allowed himself to dwell on remorse, as regret was a luxury only the living could afford without purpose. Instead, he processed their losses into data points, lessons on tactical failure when faced with superior sensory input. Their memory served not as a spur for vengeance, but as a constant, grim reminder of the cost of underestimating the unknown. One evening, while tending a carefully contained, smokeless fire, Dutch looked up at the star-dusted sky. He didn't see constellations or navigational points. He saw potential vectors, the distant homes of things capable of traversing unimaginable gulfs simply to satisfy a sporting instinct. The scale of the universe had dramatically shrunk his own accomplishments and, simultaneously, inflated the importance of this singular, horrifying secret he carried. He was the human equivalent of a field-tested prototype that had somehow survived live fire testing against superior armor, a walking case study in adaptive failure mitigation. He felt a profound, almost spiritual distance from the men he occasionally saw in the nearest small town. Men worrying about mortgages, local politics, and trivial professional slights. Their concerns seemed laughably small. They lived in the comfortable assumption that their world was the only world, that their dangers were the only dangers. Dutch knew better. He knew the ceiling of their reality was merely the floor of someone else's hunting preserve. And so, he remained vigilant, a self-appointed, unauthorized sentinel, guarding the perimeter of human ignorance, forever waiting for the silence to break with that signature, chilling sound of an ancient, patient hunter returning for a rematch. The isolation began to take on a crystalline sharpness in the perpetual twilight of the deep woods. Dutch had stopped marking the passage of time with a calendar. He measured it now in the depletion of his carefully rationed supplies and the cyclical movements of the moons overhead. An unconscious adoption of celestial navigation, learned not in a classroom, but in the chilling expanse of the alien hunter's operational theater. He found himself less prone to the intrusive memories of the battle, and more attuned to the subtle shifts in the natural world, the way the wind carried the scent of imminent snowfall differently than it carried the smell of approaching rain, or the almost imperceptible vibration in the earth that preceded a distant, heavy footfall. His physical being had hardened into an instrument of pure utility. The muscle built for military conditioning was now replaced by the wiry endurance of a lifelong tracker, lean and efficient. He no longer ate for pleasure or comfort, but for fuel, chewing slowly on dried jerky or foraged nuts, focusing on the caloric intake as if logging vital statistics for a long-term survival simulation. He had shed the last vestiges of ego. There was no glory in this existence, only necessity. His eyes, perpetually narrowed against the glare of the sun or the dark, held a disconcerting depth, the look of someone who has seen the true face of nature and found it beautiful, terrible, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. The most insidious change was the way the encounter had rewired his concept of weakness. In the military, weakness was sloppiness, missed protocol, or visible fear. Here, weakness was reliance, on technology, on backup, on the illusion of safety provided by lines drawn on maps. The predator had taught him that reliance was suicide. He trusted only the solidity of the ground beneath his boots and the sharpness of his own honed instincts. When he spoke aloud, which was rare, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp, unused to carrying beyond the immediate need to assess the wind. He often thought about the trophy aspect of the creature's existence. They were not exterminated for territory or resources. They were collected for sport. This reduced Dutch's entire career, the medals, the commendations, the classified missions, to the equivalent of collecting rare butterflies. The realization didn't incite rage. It bred a cold, focused resolve. If he was to be a trophy, he would make the effort required to earn that trophy so costly that the hunter would think twice about placing him on the shelf. Sometimes, when the moon was new and the shadows were absolute, Dutch would stand at the edge of the clearing, his posture relaxed yet poised. He was no longer actively hiding. He was being hidden by the environment he had painstakingly learned to read and integrate with. He wasn't waiting for the helicopter to return, nor was he waiting for the military to call him back. He was waiting for the shimmer in the air, the soft, almost inaudible sigh of displacement that meant the apex hunter had decided this particular patch of wilderness held enough challenge to merit a visit. He was the anomaly now, the survivor who refused to forget. And in that stubborn refusal to forget lay his only real defense. The 1987 original Predator endures not merely as a quintessential action film, but as a masterclass in escalating tension built upon a deceptively simple premise. The hunter becomes the hunted. When we first meet Dutch Schaefer and his elite, muscle-bound team of commandos, a veritable who's who of 1980s cinematic machismo, the film establishes a familiar, almost comforting rhythm. They are the apex predators of their jungle environment, seasoned professionals whose confidence borders on arrogance. Arnold Schwarzenegger, fresh off his peak action deity phase following Commando and the Terminator, embodies this peak physical prowess. His Dutch is less a man of deep emotional complexity and more a physical instrument perfectly tuned for warfare, a reflection of the era's obsession with muscular heroism. The ensemble surrounding Schwarzenegger is carefully curated to represent peak military capability. Carl Weathers, playing Dylan, brings a history suggested by his very presence, hinting at shadowy past assignments and a pragmatic, slightly world-weary edge that contrasts with Dutch's more direct approach. Weathers, whose career peaked slightly earlier with Rocky, brings an understated gravitas, suggesting a man who understands the bureaucratic cost of such violence. Each member, from Jesse Ventura's wisecracking Blaine to Shane Black's perpetually nervous Hawkins, a prescient casting choice given Black's future as a celebrated writer and director himself, serves a distinct function within this hunting unit, making their subsequent dismantling all the more impactful. The jungle setting of Val Verde is crucial. Directed by John McTiernan, who demonstrated an acute understanding of claustrophobic action with Die Hard, the dense, humid canopy acts as the film's primary antagonist, long before the alien reveals itself. McTiernan understands that true fear is rooted in the unknown and the unseen. The early sequences, where the team tracks Soviet-backed guerrillas, are shot with a palpable sense of heat and oppressive natural surroundings. This initial mission grounds the audience in the soldiers' expertise, making their slow realization of being outmatched all the more terrifying. The discovery of the massive skinned bodies left hanging, a grotesque trophy wall, shifts the tone instantly from military thriller to survival horror. The gradual reveal of the predator is a triumph of suspense. The creature is introduced not through a jump scare, but through its technological superiority, the thermal imaging vision. This mechanic brilliantly inverts the power dynamic. Suddenly, the heroes, so accustomed to seeing their environment through their own technological lenses, night vision, advanced weaponry, are blinded, reduced to thermal ghosts in a world where their killer sees them as brightly colored targets. The sound design plays a vital role here. The creature's eerie, clicking vocalizations and signature electronic whistles are just as effective as any visual representation. The film excels in its use of implied menace over sustained visibility. For much of the second act, the predator remains unseen, its presence marked only by felled trees, vanished comrades, and the disturbing aftermath of its kills. This draws heavily on classic monster movie tropes, channeling inspiration from works where the true terror lies in the audience's imagination, filling the void left by the unseen monster. When we finally see the creature in full, a masterpiece of practical effects and creature design by Stan Winston, it feels earned, a culmination of sustained dread rather than cheap shock. The blend of primitive savagery, the massive spear, the bone trophies, and advanced technology, the cloaking device, the shoulder cannon, creates a truly unique cinematic adversary. The final act pivots entirely onto Dutch, As his team is systematically wiped out, his bravado dissolves into primal panic, and then, crucially, into strategic adaptation. This transformation is the film's most compelling narrative arc. Stripped of his advanced weaponry and forced to rely on jungle lore, Dutch sheds the armor of the modern soldier. His decision to use mud as camouflage, a callback to primitive hunting techniques, is not merely a plot device. It symbolizes his reintegration into the natural food chain, forcing him to think like the very hunter he is facing. When the final confrontation occurs, stripped down and facing the aliens' technological prowess with only fire and wits, Schwarzenegger delivers a performance rooted in desperate survival rather than heroic certainty. Predator ultimately functions as a commentary on military hubris, suggesting that no amount of technology or training can truly prepare humanity for something truly alien, something that operates outside the known rules of engagement. It's a visceral, perfectly paced exercise in escalating dread that remains remarkably potent even decades later. The emotional residue left by the jungle's relentless humidity and the invisible enemy clings to every frame, intensifying the sense of isolation. As the men fall, the ensemble cast dissolves, leaving behind raw, unscripted reactions that ground the escalating absurdity of their predicament. We see the distinct personalities of the team members crumble under pressure. Dylan, ever the pragmatist, attempts to maintain tactical superiority, yet even his seasoned cynicism can't account for a foe that violates the very laws of warfare they operate under. His betrayal by his own government's involvement, the mission being essentially a setup to test the creature, adds a layer of tragic irony to his demise. He was disposable personnel all along. Blaine, initially the epitome of 80s cocky disregard, provides some necessary levity, but his fatalistic joke about the heat and the mosquitoes is cut short by a searing blast from the Predator's plasma caster, a moment that instantly silences the film's prior swagger. Jesse Ventura, physically dominating as Blaine, is reduced to a smoking silhouette, a stark visual metaphor for the sudden, absolute power differential. Even the relatively minor characters, Mac and Poncho, demonstrate a believable descent into near hysteria, their reliance on communication systems becoming useless noise as the environment turns hostile. What makes the Predator such an effective antagonist is its lack of recognizable motivation. It hunts purely for sport, for the thrill of the chase and the acquisition of trophies. This is the antithesis of the soldier's purpose, which is rooted in geopolitical conflict and defined objectives. The creature's methodology, clean kills, precise targeting, and strategic retreats, suggests an ancient, ritualistic form of combat rather than mere alien invasion. This lack of human relatable context, no demands, no political maneuvering, pushes Dutch and the survivors into a pure state of existential dread. Shane Black's Hawkins, with his nervous energy, functions as the audience's proxy early on, signaling unease that the others dismiss as the jitters of a less experienced operator. His eventual fate, being snatched violently from his hiding spot, validates the terror the audience has been anticipating. McTiernan frames these deaths not as glorious battlefield sacrifices, but as swift, brutal executions, leaving the audience with the sickening realization that in this ecosystem, military hierarchy and specialized training are meaningless defenses. Dutch's isolation is further amplified by his relationship with Anna, the sole survivor among the auxiliary personnel. Anna, played by Elpidia Carrillo, represents a different kind of resilience, one rooted in enduring cycles of violence inherent to the region, rather than professional training. Her presence forces Dutch to briefly step outside his command role and operate on a more fundamental, human level of self-preservation. The dynamic shifts from a military operation to a shared flight for life. The film's climax in the clearing, following Dutch's mud camouflage application, is visually arresting. The shift in color palette, from the saturated greens of the jungle to the earthy browns of the camouflage, signals Dutch's psychological shift. When the cloaking field flickers and the Predator is briefly revealed in its full, towering glory, The effect is stunning because the audience has been conditioned to see only heat signatures. The final hand-to-hand fight, leveraging traps and rudimentary explosives against plasma weaponry, feels earned. It's Schwarzenegger's character stripping away the facade of the decade's cinematic ideal, the invincible super soldier, and becoming something far more primal and effective. A survivor utilizing cunning over firepower. The final booming explosion and the alien's self-destruction confirm that the environment, rather than military might, was the ultimate decider of who reigned supreme on that blood-soaked patch of Central American wilderness. The shift in Dutch's demeanor post-massacre is where the film truly transcends the typical action framework of the era. Schwarzenegger, whose persona was built on near invincibility, is suddenly forced into vulnerability. This vulnerability is not just physical exhaustion, but a profound emotional reckoning with incompetence. He has been bested by an opponent that doesn't follow human rules of engagement, forcing him to discard the doctrine he lives by. This necessity fuels his intellectual rebirth in the wild. He stops being a commanding officer and becomes an applied ecologist of violence. His dialogue, once terse and directive, becomes ragged, punctuated by frustrated bellows into the jungle canopy, acknowledging the sheer absurdity of fighting something that renders all military-grade technology obsolete. The dynamic with Anna becomes fascinating because she embodies the civilian knowledge that the highly trained military team overlooked. She understands the jungle as a living entity, not just a tactical backdrop. Her survival instincts, honed outside the rigid structure of the U.S. Special Forces, become invaluable. While the soldiers relied on maps and radio frequencies, Anna relies on intuition and an understanding of local dangers, contrasting sharply with the team's expensive high-tech equipment, which ultimately proved useless against thermal vision and invisibility. This juxtaposition subtly critiques the hubris inherent in assuming technological superiority guarantees victory over nature or the truly unknown. Stan Winston's design of the Predator is a key factor in the film's lasting appeal, moving beyond simple menace into the realm of myth. The creature is a chimera of biological and mechanical terror, the dreadlocks evoking ancient, tribal warriors, the mandibles suggesting primal ferocity, and the armor plates hinting at disciplined, extraterrestrial evolution. It carries its weaponry with the casual authority of a seasoned hunter displaying his tools. When it utilizes its self-destruct sequence, it doesn't just eliminate evidence, it executes a final, absolute assertion of superiority. If it cannot claim the ultimate trophy, it will ensure no one can study its spoils. This action elevates the creature from mere monster to a near deity of the hunt, whose ethics, however alien, are rigidly adhered to. McTiernan's direction ensures that the emotional beats land precisely amidst the violence. The lingering shots on the aftermath, the scorched earth, the unnaturally quiet jungle following a firefight, force the audience to process the cost of the spectacle. The film uses silence not as a lull, but as an active participant in the tension. Every rustle of leaves becomes a potential threat, and the space between the deaths becomes heavier than the deaths themselves. This mastery of pacing is what distinguishes Predator from its more straightforward contemporaries. It understands that the space before the reveal is where true fear resides. By the time Dutch engages in his final desperate physical contest, he has been stripped down to his most basic survivalist core, a performance that required Schwarzenegger to show a grit based on wits rather than brute strength, ultimately validating the film's core thesis. Against the truly alien, specialized training is just another layer of vanity waiting to be shed. The legacy of Predator is deeply entwined with the evolving landscape of action cinema throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. While the film is often remembered for its high-octane sequences and iconic one-liners, its true innovation lies in its deconstruction of the invincible action hero archetype. Schwarzenegger, at the zenith of his physical stardom, delivers a performance that is paradoxically his most nakedly exposed. He moves from total control to absolute desperation, a journey that subtly signals a coming shift in blockbuster filmmaking, moving away from purely muscular dominance towards narratives that demanded more intellectual or emotional engagement, even within the confines of the genre. The film inadvertently paved the way for a different kind of hero, one who had to be smarter, not just stronger, to survive the new cinematic threats emerging. The supporting cast's specific skills, meant to underscore military professionalism, become the narrative's cruelest irony. Dillon, with his CIA background and knowledge of covert operations, represents the administrative layer of warfare, the men who deploy resources, but rarely face the true consequences. His final moments, grappling in the mud, strip away that bureaucratic distance, forcing him to confront the visceral reality his career had insulated him from. His fate is a critique of the military-industrial complex. The tools they sent in were never meant to win against this adversary, only to serve as bait, or perhaps sacrificial testing material. The soundscape crafted by the team is another masterful element that contributes to the film's enduring psychological grip. Beyond the creature's specific vocalizations, the constant, oppressive ambient noise of the jungle, the buzzing insects, the dripping water, the distant sounds of unknown activity, blurs the line between actual threat and auditory hallucination brought on by stress. This sonic assault mirrors the sensory overload that the soldiers experience, leading to frayed nerves and misjudgments. When the predator deactivates its cloaking device, the sudden transition from that high-frequency auditory tension to the heavy physical sounds of the alien's footsteps and breathing is jarring, a precise sonic cue that the rules of engagement have permanently changed. Furthermore, the film's success established a template for the unbeatable alien hunter narrative that would be revisited in various forms. The Predator is a sophisticated extraterrestrial being whose technology is superior, but whose driving force is archaic, the hunt for prestige. This contrast, advanced science used for primitive sport, allows the narrative to explore themes of colonialism and the arrogance of assuming human dominance over the natural world. The jungle itself acts as a neutral arbiter, favoring adaptation and instinct over training and gadgetry. Dutch's eventual victory is not a triumph of American military superiority, but a testament to individual human cunning when stripped bare of societal constructs and expensive weaponry. It's a return to the caveman utilizing fire against a superior beast, emphasizing intelligence as the ultimate evolutionary advantage. A sentiment that resonated strongly as audiences began to tire of the purely testosterone-fueled heroes of the preceding years. The film's enduring power is rooted in the successful marriage of visceral action and intelligent thematic underpinning. The critical success and longevity of Predator cemented John McTiernan's reputation as a director uniquely adept at handling action narratives that require psychological density alongside kinetic energy. His ability to sustain suspense in confined or seemingly open spaces, a skill honed in Die Hard, was fully deployed here, transforming the jungle from a mere setting into an active participant in the psychological warfare. McTiernan frames the violence not as catharsis, but as subtraction. Each death removes an element of the team's collective capability and certainty, shrinking the cinematic canvas until only the most primal elements remain: Dutch, the creature, and the environment. This deliberate narrative paring down forces the audience into the same claustrophobic mental state as the protagonist. The relationship between Schwarzenegger's Dutch and Carl Weathers' Dillon is pivotal to the film's underlying tension, moving beyond typical soldierly rivalry. Dillon's cool exterior suggests a deep-seated guilt, or perhaps a knowledge of the mission's darker truths, that the team was expendable or worse, reconnaissance for a far more dangerous entity. This backstory, subtly implied through Weathers' guarded performance, suggests a man who has made moral compromises for strategic necessity. His final confrontation is less about defeating the Predator and more about a desperate attempt to prove his worth in the face of inevitable failure. a final, futile act of proving he is still tactically relevant. His death, messy and unheroic compared to the clean, detached killings, underscores the theme that in this hunt, protocol is irrelevant. The influence of classic adventure literature and cinema is palpable, lending Predator a deeper resonance than standard sci-fi action fare. The narrative echoes tropes found in stories of lost tribes or encounters with untamed nature, where the civilized man is forced to revert to savagery to survive. Dutch's adoption of primal camouflage and traps is a direct homage to figures like Tarzan or characters from pulp adventure novels, suggesting that true mastery of survival lies not in technology, but in adaptability rooted in deep understanding of the immediate surroundings. The film essentially argues that for all their training, the commandos were too specialized. They were built for recognizable enemies, not for an anomaly that operates outside the established framework of human conflict. The practical effects employed for the Predator, meticulously crafted by Stan Winston's team, avoid the uncanny valley that plagues many creature features. Winston designed the creature to look organic yet alien, blending reptilian, insectoid, and humanoid features. This ambiguity is key. It is recognizably a biological entity capable of pain and motive, the hunt. Yet its appearance defies easy classification, preventing the audience from projecting too much human context onto its actions. When the cloaking device fails or glitches, the momentary glimpses of the shimmering outline build a visual shorthand for danger, a distortion in reality itself, that becomes almost as frightening as the creature's full appearance. This visual language, combined with McTiernan's patient pacing, ensured that the scares were earned through atmosphere rather than cheap shock, cementing Predator as a benchmark for intelligent, suspense-driven action horror. The enduring resonance of Predator is also deeply linked to its exploration of masculinity under extreme duress, a central preoccupation of 1980s action cinema that this film brilliantly subverts. The initial assembly of Dutch's team, a group defined entirely by their physical dominance, specialized gear, and arsenal of witty, often crude banter, sets up an expectation of unstoppable American force. However, the Predator systematically dismantles this facade of hypermasculinity, revealing it to be brittle and entirely dependent on technological superiority and recognizable enemies. The jungle acts as a great equalizer, stripping away their context and exposing the raw fear beneath the bravado. Jesse Ventura's Blaine, in particular, represents the peak of this testosterone-fueled era, his constant joking and aggressive confidence suggesting an almost cheerful disregard for danger. His swift, agonizing demise, caught mid-laugh, functions as a brutal narrative execution of the film's thesis. Swagger means nothing when facing an opponent with superior tools and motivation. This abrupt silencing of machismo forces the remaining characters, especially Dutch, to confront the limitations of their established identities. The transformation experienced by Dutch is essentially a forced regression to an older, more resourceful form of male archetype, the resourceful hunter forced to rely on cunning rather than firepower. His dialogue devolves from tactical commands to guttural expressions of frustration and fear, a sound more akin to a primal scream than a military order. This vulnerability, delivered by an actor famously embodying invincibility, was radical for its time. It suggests that true strength in the face of the truly unknown lies not in muscle mass or advanced weaponry, but in the capacity for rapid, intuitive adaptation, a trait often sidelined in the era's celebration of brute force. Anna's role, while secondary, is vital in facilitating this regression. She is the grounded counterpoint to the hyper-trained military machine. While the commandos view the jungle as a grid to be navigated or a threat to be neutralized, Anna understands it as a complete, interconnected system that must be appeased or navigated subtly. Her civilian knowledge, rooted in experience rather than academy training, allows her to survive the initial chaos that decimates the professionals. She serves as a necessary anchor, ensuring Dutch remembers the fundamental rules of survival when his specialized training fails him. The environmental depiction crafted by McTiernan deserves further examination regarding emotional texture. The color palette, saturated with oppressive greens and deep shadows, creates a visual language of suspicion. The audience is constantly searching the periphery, just as the soldiers are. The moments where the predator is only visible as a subtle distortion in the heat haze, the air itself shimmering unnaturally, are profoundly unsettling because they suggest the laws of physics are being bent around the hunter. This sensory deception elevates the narrative beyond simple science fiction into the realm of psychological horror, where the very perception of reality cannot be trusted. The predator is not just killing them, it is psychologically fracturing their understanding of the world around them before the physical killing begins. This layered approach ensures that the film remains not just a thrilling action movie, but a sharp examination of human hubris when confronted by superior, non-human intelligence operating on purely aesthetic principles of the hunt. The lasting impact of Predator can also be measured by its influence on the depiction of military special operations in cinema, specifically highlighting the inherent dangers of outsourcing violence to highly trained, yet ultimately disposable assets. The initial scene where Dutch's team effortlessly neutralizes the guerrilla camp establishes their competence with almost arrogant efficiency. They are portrayed as flawless instruments of American military reach, capable of projecting overwhelming force into hostile territory. This competence, however, serves primarily to set the stage for their catastrophic failure. Their training, designed for combat against human adversaries with discernible motives and tactical limitations, proves fatally insufficient against an opponent that violates every established rule of engagement. Dillon's ambiguous role, a former special ops operative now seemingly working in a liaison or oversight capacity, introduces a layer of governmental conspiracy that feeds the atmosphere of paranoia. Weathers plays Dillon with a cautious professionalism that suggests he is aware of the true nature of their deployment, that they are not merely performing a rescue or retaliation mission, but rather acting as advanced scouts or bait. His eventual fate, dying while attempting to leverage his tactical acumen against the creature, is a direct indictment of the bureaucratic distance between the planners and the executioners. The film subtly suggests that in the world of covert operations, the individual soldier's life is valued far less than the intelligence gathered, a chilling coda to the gung-ho spirit of many contemporary action films. The sound design deserves reiteration not just for the creature's mechanical clicks, but for the way silence is weaponized. After the initial contact and the subsequent loss of several men, the jungle descends into an unnerving quietude, broken only by the panicked breathing of the survivors. McTiernan uses this lack of conventional noise to amplify minor organic sounds, a snapped twig, the rustle of mud disturbed by movement, into major dramatic events. This auditory trickery forces the audience to share the survivors' hypervigilance, transforming the simple act of listening into an exhausting mental ordeal. The jungle ceases to be a backdrop and becomes a pressurized chamber where every sensory input must be critically analyzed for signs of the invisible threat. Dutch's final confrontation, an almost absurd mismatch of primitive weaponry against advanced plasma technology, is aesthetically resolved through his embrace of the environment. When he covers himself in mud, he isn't just hiding, he is shedding the protective layers of modernity and assuming the guise of the primordial hunter. Schwarzenegger's physical transformation in this final stretch, from the bulky, heavily armed commander to a lean, almost naked figure relying on leverage and fire, is the film's most significant visual metaphor. It posits that against an existential, unpredictable threat, the only viable defense is not superior technology, but superior adaptability and an understanding of fundamental physical principles. The very act of surviving proves that human ingenuity, when stripped of artifice, can still triumph over technological supremacy, even if that technology hails from across the stars. This theme resonates deeply, offering a satisfying, if harsh, conclusion to the decade's obsession with overwhelming firepower. The psychological toll exacted by the predator's unseen presence is perhaps the film's most potent weapon, far outweighing the spectacle of its plasma blasts. It's a sustained exercise in gaslighting the viewer alongside the characters. When the highly disciplined commandos, men trained to spot conventional ambushes from miles away, begin to see things, or fail to see the clearest threats, the audience's certainty about what constitutes reality on screen begins to erode. This breakdown is brilliantly illustrated through the fate of Hawkins, the nervous analyst played by Shane Black. Black, who would later masterfully write and direct his own action comedies reflecting on strained male relationships, plays Hawkins as the canary in the coal mine. His anxiety is the first honest reaction to the situation, dismissed by the more overtly macho members of the squad as simple fear. His violent, unceremonious removal from the trees serves as definitive proof that the jungle itself has become sentiently hostile, orchestrated by an alien intelligence. The creature's arsenal and trophy collection speak volumes about its motivation, which remains refreshingly devoid of recognizable human greed or political maneuvering. The collection of spines and skulls is not for territorial marking. It is art, the meticulous curation of a seasoned sportsman. This dedication to the pure aesthetic of the hunt is what truly alienates the soldiers. They operate within a system of objectives, collateral damage, and measurable outcomes. The predator operates on a system of challenge and acquisition. This fundamental philosophical mismatch is why military strategy fails so spectacularly. Dylan, attempting to lure the creature with flares and tactical formations, is engaging in a game the predator has already mastered across millennia. His last moments are a frantic attempt to regain control over a situation that has slipped entirely outside the purview of human management. The final sequence, where Dutch sheds all pretense of being a modern soldier, becomes an almost anthropological study in survival. His use of mud is not just camouflage. It's a symbolic baptism back into the natural order, a concession that he must think like the beast to defeat it. This required Schwarzenegger to tap into a raw, desperate energy rarely showcased in his physique-driven roles. There are no easily delivered punchlines or triumphant poses. There is only sweat, desperation, and meticulous planning centered around fire and leverage. The predator, in its final moments before self-destruction, seems almost surprised, perhaps even marginally impressed, that its prey managed to adapt so fundamentally. The booming final sequence, the ensuing silence, and Dutch's battered emergence from the smoke confirm that the most advanced weapon deployed that day was not government-funded hardware, but raw, terrified human ingenuity, finally stripped down to its evolutionary core. The film leaves the viewer with the lingering, chilling sense that the alien visitor was merely testing the limits of human evolution, finding them wanting until the very last moment. The lasting cultural footprint of Predator lies precisely in its refusal to be pigeonholed solely as a science fiction adventure. It functions more effectively as a primal survival thriller wrapped in the high-gloss veneer of 1980s action stardom. McTiernan masterfully employs a deliberate pacing rhythm that forces the audience to endure the same psychological erosion as the characters. The long sequences of stalking, where the only sign of the creature is a slight disturbance in the canopy or the unsettling shimmer of its thermal reflection, condition the viewer to associate every shadow and sound with imminent threat. This contrasts sharply with the hyperkinetic pacing of many contemporary action films, establishing a template where dread is a far more valuable commodity than direct confrontation. The chemistry, or rather the calculated friction, between Dutch and Dylan underscores the film's critique of specialized military culture. Dylan, with his cooler demeanor and implied knowledge of covert dealings, represents the political and strategic maneuvering that puts men like Dutch on the ground. Weathers embodies the weariness of the operative who understands that missions often serve higher, murkier purposes than simple objectives. His death, an attempt to draw the creature into a trap, feels like a final, desperate attempt by the bureaucrat to control a situation that has devolved into pure, messy chaos. This contrasts with the deaths of the more straightforward soldiers, which feel like brutal eliminations, whereas Dylan's death carries a heavy undertone of tragic entanglement with forces beyond his command. Furthermore, the creature's design by Stan Winston serves as a brilliant piece of mythological layering. The blend of primitive iconography, the dreadlocks, the imposing height, the bone trophies, with hyper-advanced targeting systems, suggests an evolutionary path completely divergent from humanity's. It is the ultimate apex predator, one that has mastered not just physical prowess, but the technology required to ensure uncontested dominance in any environment. Its hunting behavior implies a set of ancient, yet highly advanced protocols. When it uses the self-destruct device, it is not mere self-preservation. It is the final act of a sportsman refusing to allow his ultimate prize to be analyzed or understood by inferior beings. This action solidifies the predator not as an invader seeking resources or conquest, but as a cosmic trophy hunter whose existence revolves around the purity of the chase. Dutch's ultimate triumph is thus not a victory for the U.S. military apparatus, but a vindication of raw, adaptable human intelligence when divorced from its technological crutches. His final, mud-caked confrontation is visually reminiscent of ancient combat narratives, where strength is derived from leverage, understanding of physics, and sheer will to live, rather than the power settings on a shoulder-mounted cannon. Schwarzenegger successfully navigates the transition from the era's unstoppable icon to a resourceful survivor, providing a crucial narrative bridge toward the more complex, flawed heroes that would populate action cinema in the ensuing decade. The film argues that against the truly unknown variable, specialized training is merely a set of predictable responses, easily exploited by a truly alien intellect. The thematic density of Predator is further amplified by its subtle exploration of what constitutes true prowess versus mere technological augmentation. The initial confidence of Dutch's team is entirely predicated on their gear. The automatic weapons, the communication arrays, the heavy armor, tools that signify human dominance in the late 20th century. The Predator systematically strips them of these advantages, functioning as a living, breathing litmus test for genuine capability. When the jungle environment renders their high-tech surveillance useless, their training itself becomes a liability, leading them to rely on doctrine when instinct is required. This sets up a powerful, almost Darwinian argument within the film: specialization breeds fragility. The supporting characters, though ostensibly action archetypes, serve crucial roles in demonstrating the various ways human hubris manifests. Mac and Poncho, reduced to panicked survivors after the first major encounter, showcase the rapid erosion of professional composure. Their reliance on group cohesion dissolves under invisible threat, leading to irrational decisions. Even their banter, once an attempt to manage stress, becomes frantic noise as the hierarchy breaks down. This disintegration provides a stark counterpoint to Dutch's eventual, almost solitary restructuring of his purpose. He realizes that the team structure, designed for human conflict, is a fatal weakness against a single, perfectly adapted predator. The visual grammar employed by McTiernan consistently reinforces the sense of being watched and judged. The use of heat vision, while a neat science fiction conceit, operates primarily as a psychological tool. It visually symbolizes the predator's detachment. It is observing the humans as objects defined purely by their thermal output, their life force, rather than their intent or identity. When Dutch adopts the mud camouflage, he is consciously disrupting this alien metric. He is literally painting himself out of the predator's recognized sensory spectrum, trading visibility for invisibility, a calculated surrender of his recognizable human form to embrace the chaos of the natural world. This act is a meta-commentary on the necessity of abandoning established norms when facing truly novel threats. Moreover, the film's narrative debt to classic monster myths is profound. The predator is less an invader and more a force of nature, an elemental check on human arrogance. Unlike invading aliens seeking conquest or resources, this creature seeks only the perfection of the hunt, echoing ancient tales of mythical beasts that test the mettle of heroes. This elevated status explains why the creature is never truly defeated by conventional means. It is only evaded or tricked by one individual who manages to shed his civilization and adopt a more ancient, cunning survival ethos.